In June 1944, a group of about 50 German female prisoners of war stood huddled together on the cold concrete floor of a prison camp in Texas, USA. They had just endured a long, guarded journey across the ocean and were now faced with overwhelming fear. Was the terrifying thing they had been warned about truly about to happen? Before that, Nazi propaganda officers had filled their heads with the belief that Americans were merciless savages who would torture or execute prisoners. The women trembled as they were ordered to take a shower, haunted by the suspicion that the shower room was merely a cover for a gas chamber, just as the rumors had said. They held their breath, bracing for the worst. But then, warm water began to flow from the rusty shower heads. There was no gas, no screaming, only clean water and fragrant soap handed to each woman by the American guards. A few prisoners burst into tears for the first time. They cried out of sheer relief. All were stunned to realize that everything happening was the exact opposite of what they had feared. The Americans didn't kill them. On the contrary, the guards even handed them towels and clean clothes after the shower. That unexpected kindness left the German women both grateful and bewildered. They quietly began to wonder, could it be that the enemy wasn't the monster they had believed all this time? To understand why these women were so stunned upon arriving at the American prison camp, we need to turn back the clock, back to the time when they still wore German uniforms and held unwavering faith in everything they had been taught. Among them stood out a young signal operator named Greta, 21 years old, serving in the communications unit of the German army. She was not a frontline soldier, but every line of coded message she transmitted played a part in keeping the Nazi war machine running smoothly. Greta grew up in the heart of the Nazi regime, where every breath, every book, every radio program was steeped in extreme nationalist ideology. She had been taught that Germans represented the pinnacle of human civilization, while those on the other side of the battlefield, especially American soldiers, were nothing but uncultured savages, dangerous and undeserving of being seen as human. In 1944, as the tide of war began to shift in favor of the Allies, Greta was assigned to the Western Front. There, during a chaotic retreat after the American landing at Normandy, her unit was surrounded. Along with dozens of other female personnel, including nurses, logistics staff, and signal operators, Greta was captured in a forest near the combat zone. Her greatest fear at that moment wasn't death. It was what would come afterward, being handed over to the brutes she was certain would torture, humiliate, or kill her without a second thought. With that mindset, Greta entered captivity carrying not just her old uniform, but also a heavy burden of deep-rooted prejudice and a fear greater than any bullet. Yet what awaited her was far beyond anything a young soldier's mind had ever imagined to be real. After several days of temporary confinement somewhere in Europe, Greta and a group of female prisoners were told they would be transferred to another location, somewhere safer, while awaiting an official decision. No one explained where that was. All they knew was that they were loaded onto trucks, then onto trains, and finally led down into the freezing cargo hold of a giant steel ship. The journey lasted for weeks. There was no light, no fresh air, only the sound of waves and the cold, metallic echoes that chilled them to the bone. It wasn't until much later that Greta learned the ship had been one of America's famous Liberty ships, massive transport vessels that once carried troops and weapons to Europe, now returning across the Atlantic with German prisoners on board. From 1943 to 1945, as the number of captured Axis soldiers grew, the British found themselves without enough facilities to detain them. They asked the United States for help, and America agreed. In less than 2 years, over 400,000 German prisoners were shipped to the United States and placed in nearly 500 camps scattered across the country. Most of these camps were in the South, in places like Texas, Georgia, and Louisiana, where the warm climate and wide-open land made them easier to manage. Greta was just one of thousands in those prisoner transfers, a tiny figure in the grand machinery of war, but for her it marked a turning point. None of them had ever imagined they would one day set foot in America, much less as prisoners, and certainly not alive. Greta remembered those nights on the ship vividly, the howling wind at sea, the constant hum of engines beneath the steel floor. and the violent shudders each time the crew reported that a German submarine might be nearby. It was a cruel irony. German U-boats were still patrolling the waters, ambushing American supply ships. And if they encountered this one, Greta and her fellow prisoners could very well be sent to the bottom of the ocean not by enemies, but by their own people. Not out of hatred, but because Nazi leadership believed that it was better to let their soldiers drown than fall into enemy hands. That idea wasn't foreign to them. It had been drilled into every Nazi soldier's mind as a sacred command. When the ship finally docked in New Orleans, Greta barely had time to collect herself before being herded onto a train. Along with hundreds of others, she was crammed into windowless freight cars and transported for 2 full days through the vast American countryside, never once seeing daylight. Darkness, heavy breathing, the stench of sweat, and gnawing hunger made the air so thick it felt impossible to breathe. Some began to cry, others whispered prayers. In Greta's mind, one thought repeated endlessly, "We're not getting out of this. If they don't execute us, they'll torture us to death." But when the train finally stopped and the last metal door creaked open, Greta didn't see bayonets. She didn't see a grim labor camp. Instead, she saw a wooden fence, a gate, and a sign that read, Camp Hearn, POW area. Hearn, Texas, one of the largest prisoner-of-war camps for Germans in the United States. Locals sometimes jokingly called it the Fritz Ritz, a nickname that was half mockery, half envy, referring to how clean and orderly the place was, almost no different from a regular US Army base. On her very first night, Greta was handed a clean set of bedding, a light wool sweater, and to her astonishment, a slice of bread with butter, a luxury she hadn't tasted in over a year. As she stepped into the barracks, seeing polished wooden bunk beds, bright whitewashed floors, and flushing toilets, she could hardly believe this was supposed to be a prison camp. "Feels like we're checking into a motel for American troops," a fellow prisoner muttered beside her, and deep down, Greta began to feel unsettled. Could it be that everything she had believed, feared, and hated had been wrong from the start? Life at Camp Hearn was so calm that it left Greta in disbelief. Every day, she was given full meals, meat, vegetables, even fruit and chocolate, things long vanished from her homeland. The showers had hot water, the blankets were clean, clothing was issued to every prisoner, along with essential personal items. She often caught herself thinking, being a prisoner in America felt more comfortable than being a civilian back in Germany. The camp's discipline wasn't too strict. Greta was free to walk around the compound, do light work like tending the garden or laundry, and she was paid in canteen coupons, enough to buy soap, lotion, even candy. Outside of work hours, she played sports, joined evening classes taught by other prisoners, read books, and watched movies, things she had never imagined possible in captivity. But the longer she stayed, the more conflicted Greta became. Part of her felt guilty for living in better conditions than her family back home. Another part of her started to question everything she had once believed to be true. She saw that the Americans, even the black soldiers, were not brutal or inferior as the propaganda claimed. They were polite, patient, and at times, even kind. With each passing day, Greta's view of the enemy shifted. No longer monsters, just people. And perhaps that realization was the most unsettling of all. During her days behind barbed wire and the daily sound of roll call, what Greta looked forward to the most wasn't a warm meal or the next movie night. It was the quiet moment when she could sit down, pick up a pen, and write a letter to her mother. After months of being captured, shuffled between temporary camps, and shipped across half the world to America, this was the first time she could send a signal home. "I'm still here, and I'm still your daughter." Following the Geneva Convention, the administration at Camp Hearn allowed German prisoners to write letters regularly and send them through the Red Cross. Paper and envelopes were handed out at the end of the week. The content would be reviewed by censors, but most personal messages were left untouched. For Greta, that first letter wasn't a duty, it was a quiet conversation with the people she once believed she would never see again. She wrote slowly, choosing every word with care. After a brief opening to reassure her mother, Greta paused a long time before continuing. Every sentence had to be precise, not too emotional, but not so vague it would cause worry. Inside the warmth of the barracks, with sunlight from the Texas sky streaming through the window, Greta felt a strange mix of comfort and guilt. In the letter, she wrote plainly, "Mother, please don't worry about me. The Americans have not harmed us. They treat us decently and feed us well every day." Greta didn't mention the meat, the warm bread, or the hot showers. She knew those things had become luxuries back home. Telling too much would make her mother sad, but leaving out the Americans' kindness would feel dishonest. So Greta chose to keep only what needed to be said, letting her emotions speak through the space between her words. At the end of the letter, she gently added a small note, not about herself, but about her mother. "Please, take care of your health. I have everything I need here. I just hope our family can find a little corner of peace, too." That was all Greta could send, a small shard of truth in the middle of a world war, but for her family, it might have changed everything. Not just because their daughter was alive, but because kindness had come from the very place they were taught to hate most. That short letter, though modest in length, carried the seed of something bigger, the beginning of a shift in how Greta and her family saw the enemy. Greta didn't stop at comfort and reassurance. As the letter neared its end, she felt a growing need to say something deeper, not just to calm her mother's fears, but to set down thoughts she had never dared to speak aloud. She couldn't write about politics, nor mention battle tactics, or war updates. Anything like that would be blacked out. But between the ordinary lines, Greta quietly folded in a message full of reflection. "I hope the war ends soon, so everyone can live like human beings again." Just one simple sentence, yet within it lay an entire world transforming inside the mind of a young prisoner who was once raised under the slogan, "Germany above all." No more praise for the ideals she once believed. No mention of victory, glory, or duty. What she longed for now was peace, a modest life, and a world free from hatred. Greta understood that she didn't need to spell it out. Her mother would read between the lines. This war was far from glorious, and survival, even as a prisoner, could sometimes feel like a blessing. In that quiet realization, Greta was no longer a German soldier under the Nazi banner, but simply a young woman who had walked through fear, disillusionment, and bitterness, and was now beginning to see the world with different eyes. When she put the pen down and sealed the envelope, Greta felt a sense of relief. The letter wasn't long, dramatic, or embellished. But to her, it was the first time in many months she could speak the truth, even just a piece of it, and send it home, to the place she once called Heimat. A few weeks later, in a small town in northern Germany, Greta's mother received the letter, stamped and censored by the Red Cross. In the hunger and anxiety of those final war days, she could hardly believe her eyes when she saw her daughter's name on the envelope. Greta was alive. The older woman fumbled to open the letter, her tears falling as she read the first lines from her daughter, but joy quickly gave way to utter disbelief. She read and reread the part where Greta described life in the American POW camp. Meat, cakes, warm blankets, kind American guards. To a German mother surviving on bread made from sugar beet and sawdust, Greta's words seemed too incredible, almost absurd. How could the enemy be treating her daughter better than their own army treated its soldiers? For a moment, she even wondered if Greta had been forced to write this under the enemy's gun. That evening, Greta's family invited her in-laws over. Her husband was still deployed at the front to read the letter together. The room fell silent at Greta's revelations. Her father, a World War I veteran, sighed and muttered, "The Americans, they're not who we thought they were." He remembered how POWs had been brutalized on both sides during the Great War, and now, his daughter seemed to be living comfortably despite being a prisoner. Her mother felt both relief and unease. She was glad Greta was safe and well treated, but also feared her daughter might be sugarcoating the truth to protect them from worry. Still, she began to believe the words were genuine. The details felt too specific, too intimate, to be faked. Mentions of baked apples, roast turkey, and Christmas church services didn't sound like propaganda. "Only she would remember the kind of apple cake I used to make," the mother whispered through tears. Even though the Nazi regime tightly controlled all information, What couldn't be printed in newspapers found its way into everyday life through letters, whispered conversations, and shared experiences. Starting in mid-1944, at family gatherings or through neighbors' words, rumors began to circulate quietly. German POWs in America were being treated humanely. No official headlines ever acknowledged it. Newspapers of the time only praised loyalty, sacrifice, and death. But in the letters that crossed the ocean, even with their censored lines, people began to read strange clues. I'm eating well. I sleep warm. Don't worry about me. At first, many people were skeptical. How could the enemy possibly be feeding their children well, keeping them warm, and letting them live in peace inside prison camps? Some die-hard loyalists reacted more harshly, dismissing it all as fake news fabricated by the enemy to break the fighting spirit of the German people. The fear of being deceived, along with blind loyalty to the regime, led many to cling to propaganda, preferring to believe lies over the idea that the enemy might actually be humane. The Nazi authorities refused to tolerate any image of a kind America. Letters that sounded too hopeful or overly positive, especially those that praised American soldiers or criticized the war, were often withheld or had sensitive content blacked out. But by late 1944 and early 1945, the censorship system began to crack. The home front was in chaos, postal inspectors were overwhelmed, and more letters slipped through. The truth began to leak out, seeping like water through the crumbling walls of propaganda once thought unbreakable. As for Greta's family, they didn't need gossip or second-hand rumors. They had the letter, written in their daughter's familiar hand. It contained no slogans or laments, just a quiet, honest voice reaching across the ocean. I am not mistreated. I'm okay. That was all. But to a mother struggling through a firewoodless winter and a younger brother growing up amid constant hunger, those words were a beam of light cutting through the dark. If even the enemy could still show traces of human compassion, could that mean the war was nearing its end? And not long after, it did. In May 1945, World War II ended with Nazi Germany's total collapse. From Berlin to the Ruhr, from the Danube to the Baltic, the guns fell silent. Soldiers who once shouted Sieg Heil now surrendered, speechless and with bowed heads. In the POW camp in Texas, where summer had just begun, word reached Greta and the others. Germany had surrendered. The moment was a whirlwind of emotions, relief, sorrow, anxiety, and above all, confusion. Everyone was glad the war was over, but beneath the surface, a quiet fear began to grow. What now? After more than a year in a place of safety, dignity, and humane treatment, they were to return to a homeland ravaged by bombs, divided by occupying forces, and poorer than ever before. Greta suddenly realized she was no longer certain what home even meant. Was her childhood house still standing? Was her mother still alive? Would they welcome her back as a survivor, or view her as someone marked by surrender and defeat? And if returning meant leaving behind this warmth and stepping into a harsh, shattered reality, did she even have the courage to take that step? When the repatriation order was announced in late summer 1945, some of the female prisoners, Greta among them, hesitated. A few shed tears. One quietly asked the American officer, "Is there any way? We don't have to go back." The answer, of course, was no. At that time, no one thought of seeking asylum or staying in America. They were prisoners of war, and the war was over. It was time to return home. Greta and her group were put on a train, leaving Texas behind. In her hands, she carried little, a few sets of clothes, a worn-out German-English dictionary, and a white handkerchief gifted on Christmas Eve. But her most precious possession was a stack of old letters, letters that had connected her with her family and bridged two seemingly irreconcilable worlds, the Germany of war and the America of humanity. For Greta, her time as a prisoner was no longer a source of shame, but a chapter that reshaped her understanding of the world. She left Camp Hearn not as a defeated soldier, but as someone who had emerged from darkness, carrying with her memories, gratitude, and a radically changed view of what she once called the enemy. Greta's experience was far from unique. Behind the barbed wire stretched across America during World War II, hundreds of thousands of German POWs lived through similar months of captivity and left behind traces of that time in the form of small, heartfelt letters sent home. These messages, like Greta's, became inadvertent, living proof that stood in stark contrast to the Nazi propaganda fed to the German public. That Americans were monsters, the kind of enemy who must be annihilated. Instead, through each sentence, a different reality emerged, one almost too humane to believe in wartime, that even in captivity, enemies could treat each other with dignity. This wasn't just random acts of kindness, it was official policy. The U.S. military strictly abided by the 1929 Geneva Convention on the treatment of prisoners of war, ensuring German captives received conditions comparable to those of regular American troops. The camps were well organized, equipped with kitchens, medical care, libraries, even classrooms and recreational activities. Of course, compassion wasn't the only motive. The U.S. understood that humanity could also be a strategy. They wanted to set a precedent that would protect Allied POWs held by the Germans, and, more ambitiously, they hoped this very decency might become a wedge, cracking the convictions of young soldiers raised under Nazi ideals. And reality proved it true. Through every letter, every winter spent in Texas, many German POWs began to change. Not because of lectures or ideology, but through small daily observations, the respectful attitude of the guards, the attentiveness of the nurses, the way Americans treated even black soldiers, all of it slowly led them to question the worldview they had once been taught. One prisoner once wrote, "Here, I've learned how people live without hatred. I've begun to think maybe the enemy was right all along." When the war ended and the prisoners were repatriated, they didn't just carry old luggage back with them, they brought home a new perspective on the world. In the ruined villages of post-war Germany, it was often these former POWs who shared with friends and neighbors the strange things they had experienced. A POW camp with a Christmas tree, soldiers handing out handkerchiefs, meals with apple pie and chocolate. They spoke with honest eyes, and these stories helped soften hatred and lay the first bricks of reconciliation between former enemies. As for letters like Greta's, many were found decades later tucked away in old suitcases, in attic boxes, even inside crumbling biscuit tins. These became invaluable to historians, not only for their factual content, but for their profound power to move and transform. Each simple line carried a testimony that a very different America had once existed in the eyes of its enemies, not as a war-hungry superpower, but as a nation of character, of principles, and of respect for human dignity. One former POW once said, years later, "If Germans had lived the way we did in the American camps, I believe there would never have been a war." Greta likely felt the same. Once a believer in racial superiority, she quietly walked out of the war with a completely transformed view, shaped by the unexpected kindness shown to her in the most unlikely place. And from today's perspective, the letter Greta sent home that year was more than just a message to her family. It stands as a powerful reminder that even amid brutal war, there are still those who uphold humanity and that small acts of compassion can help heal a world torn apart.